For coming out on this beautiful evening, and I think everybody's been reminding me how different this was from last summer when we had hot, smoky days. I think we're thankful for this beautiful weather. And thank you for coming inside on such a beautiful evening. I think this is a very important topic. The reason we're hosting a panel like this is an important ethical issue. And I think, how things proceed forward, I think are very important for a lot of people. So as a Center for Ethics, we do like to promote education, discussion on important contemporary ethical issues, and I think climate change is one of the most important that we're looking at. We would want to let you know there is a handout that Dick Barrett put together. It's the yellow sheet, and it does lay out the differences between the two presumptive candidates. I would like to thank the Humanities Montana, one of our sponsors for the event, the Montana Conservation Voters Education Fund for sponsoring the event, and also the National Science Foundation. You can see there's graduate students around the room who are here on a debating science program, who are visiting here at the University of Montana. And lastly, I'd like to thank Dick Barrett, who's retired, so we can take full advantage of his time here at the Center for Ethics, as I said this morning, to do events like this. So thanks, Dick.
Thank you. In the interest of full disclosure, since the evening is going to be somewhat political, I hope, I am a Democratic candidate for the state legislature. Just so you know. But this is not a campaign appearance. This is not a campaign appearance.
Take these out.
And I'm not alone up here. We have more. I am going to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to make a few remarks about the fact sheet that I hope you all have gotten a copy of. So I'm going to start at the geometric right. Andrew Light is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Environmental Policy and Director of the Center for Global Ethics at George Mason University. He is also a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C., where he works on climate change and energy issues. He has authored, co-authored, and edited 17 books on environmental ethics, philosophy of technology, and aesthetics, including most recently Environmental Values in 2008 and Philosophy and Design from Engineering to Architecture, also in 2008. Next to Andrew is Mike Phillips from Bozeman, Montana. Mike is a wildlife ecologist who has spent the last 28 years working in the field of restoration ecology with an emphasis on reintroduction projects for imperiled birds, fishes, and mammals. Mike has conducted research on large carnivores throughout the continental United States, Alaska, and Australia. From 1986 through 1997, Mike led efforts for the U.S. Department of Interior to restore red wolves to the southeastern U.S. and gray wolves to Yellowstone Park. In 1997, Mike partnered with Ted Turner to launch the Turner Endangered Species Fund, a nonprofit organization that aims to conserve biological diversity by ensuring the persistence of imperiled species and their habitats with an emphasis on private land. Mike has served as the fund's executive director since inception. In 2006, Mike was elected to represent Montana's 66th House District from Bozeman. During the 2007 legislative session, there were two of you, as you'll all remember, he focused on energy policy and launched the legislature's Climate Change Caucus. He is currently seeking re-election and serving as co-chair of the Montana Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee. Next to Mike is Jim DePeso. Jim has been the policy director of Republicans for Environmental Protection since 2001. He was one of the Republicans for Environmental Protection's founders. Before working for REP, Jim worked in policy and communications for the Northwest Energy Coalition and for the Pacific Northwest Pollution Prevention Resource Center. Long ago, he worked as a newspaper reporter and holds a journalism degree from California State Polytechnic University. Jim grew up near Los Angeles back when Southern California still had open fields and wild oak forests where kids could play and learn about nature. I did too.
I remember those places. Yeah,
I don't remember them, actually, but at my age. But a born and bred Washingtonian, Juliet Alprin is graduated in 1992 magna cum laude from Princeton University, where she received a bachelor's degree in politics with a certificate in Latin American studies. In the fall of 1992, she went to Seoul, Korea on a loose scholarship, which allowed her to cover politics and economics for the English language magazine. Returning to Washington, Ms. Alprin wrote for Louisiana and Florida papers at States News Service and then joined roll call newspapers after Republicans took control of Congress in 1994. In March 1998, she joined the Washington Post as its House of Representatives reporter, where she covered the impeachment of Bill Clinton, lobbying, legislation, and 5 national congressional campaigns. Since April of 2004, she has covered the environment for the National Desk, reporting on science, policy, and politics in areas including climate change, oceans, and air quality. In pursuit of these stories, she has gone scuba diving with sharks in the Bahamas, trekking on the Arctic tundra with Salma Hayek and Jake Gyllenhaal. Gyllenhaal, you know who I'm talking about. I know who I'm talking about. And searching on her hands and knees for rare insects in the caves of Tennessee. After Democrats regained control of Congress in 2006, the Post asked Ms. Alprin to co-author an ongoing series on the House entitled Take Over, in order to examine how the new Democratic majority had transformed Capitol Hill, and she is now covering the presidential race as well as continuing to serve as the Post's national environmental reporter. During her first year at the Post, Juliet was the most prolific writer in the news staff, writing more than 200 stories. In the spring of 2005, she served as the youngest ever McGraw Professor of Journalism at Princeton University, teaching political reporting to a group of undergraduate and graduate students. In the spring of 2005, Roman and Littlefield published her first book, Fight Club Politics: How Partisanship is Poisoning the House of Representatives. Her book has been featured on several radio and television shows, including Comedy Central's The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross. Juliet is currently working on a book on sharks to be published in the spring of 2009 by Knopf Pantheon. So that's the panel. So I think we're in for a pretty interesting evening. Let me just say a few brief remarks about the fact sheet that I handed out to you that you received when you came in, that I prepared. And what I want to do here is highlight what I think are some of the major differences between McCain and Obama, or for that matter, the similarities between McCain and Obama that you can glean from reading their websites, and that's where most of this information came from. As you all know, if you've been reading the newspapers, these kinds of positions are in considerable flux. There's a lot of discussion going on these days, and I'm sure Julia can fill us in far better than I could on what the latest twists and turns are. But let me just point out what it is that we see when we go to the websites. And on the back of the sheet, by the way, you'll see the URLs for those two websites, as well as URLs for information about the panelists today. So turning first of all to cap and trade, which I would at any rate regard as the centerpiece of a climate change policy. There are a couple of things that are noteworthy and different about what McCain and Obama are proposing. And the most significant one, from my point of view, is the degree of reduction in emissions that they would try to achieve. McCain's proposing a 60% reduction in emissions compared to the 1990 levels. Compared to current levels, that would be bigger than 60%, of course. Whereas Obama is promoting 80% reductions. That, I don't know whether that sounds like a lot to you or a little to you, but it's a lot. In the discussion and lobbying and politicking that surrounded the Warner-Lieberman climate change bill during last fall and into this winter, the difference between 60% and 80%, actually the difference between 70% and 80%, was a make or break deal for many environmental organizations. So from many points of view, 80% that Obama is proposing is sort of a minimum. It's frequently described as the scientifically required level of reductions. And so there is a significant difference there. McCain has specified in his policy proposal the coverage that the cap and trade system would have, and that it would apply to the electric power and transportation fuel sectors and large commercial and industrial businesses. That leaves out about somewhere between 15 and 20% of all of the emissions that are otherwise out there. Obama doesn't say anything explicit about the coverage. Coverage is a very important issue. If the cap and trade system covers too small a portion of the economy, then meeting global reduction targets pushes much bigger burdens onto the rest of the, pushes very big burdens onto the regulated sector. So for example, if you're trying to reduce all of your emissions by say 80%, but you're only controlling half of them, then you have to reduce them by 160%, which of course isn't possible. McCain would initially start by granting allowances, most of the allowances for emitting carbon to the various industries or to the states or to a variety of sources instead of auctioning them off. Obama proposes to auction off 100% of the allowances. It's a significant matter how allowances are actually made available under a cap and trade system. If the allowances are given to people, those people, whoever gets them as a gift, is obviously receiving an asset of value. If the allowances are auctioned off, it's the taxpayers who receive that benefit because taxes can be commensurately reduced, or government expenditure programs can be commensurately increased with the revenue from auctioning the allowances. So it's a big difference whether or not you auction allowances or whether you grant them free to various polluters. Obama would use the proceeds of auction allowances to spend about to spend a significant amount of money over the next 10 years in alternative energy and conservation kinds of measures. Another significant issue, and again one in which the candidate, in this case the candidates appear to agree to some extent, McCain would allow unlimited initial use of domestic and international offsets. That means that a polluter could surrender an offset, which is for all of the pollution that they had engaged in. What an offset means is that you could go and pay someone to reduce pollution, carbon emissions somewhere else, or to capture carbon emissions somewhere else, in this case anywhere in the world, okay? And therefore offset your emissions so that you could be, quote, carbon neutral. This is a very controversial matter, and the reason that it's so controversial is because there's a big problem in making sure that the offsets are verifiable and genuinely marginal. That is, that they genuinely wouldn't have taken place without the offset being paid for. In other words, if somebody was going to grow trees anyway, and now you pay them to grow those trees, you're not carbon neutral. You have to pay them to grow more trees than they otherwise would have, or otherwise it's not going to work. Finally, the last issue that I want to mention here is the question of cost containment. Neither candidate has fully specified whether or not they would have some kind of automatic cost containment mechanism. Some of the bills that have come up in Congress would contain those cost containment mechanisms. And what these things are is automatic triggers that say, if we hit some kind of indication of cost, usually it's in terms of the price of the allowances in the market, if we hit some kind of automatic indicator of costs, then you can create more allowances. So we're going to give up on controlling emissions. How those mechanisms work is a source of very great controversy as well. And what these candidates would accept, I don't know. I'm going to stop there. You can read the rest of these things. There are significant differences in the candidates, and I'm sure, again, Julia's going to want to fill us in on this in terms of their attitudes towards nuclear, offshore drilling. These are the issues that have been much in play in the last couple of weeks. And you can see the elements that Obama and McCain have here in terms of their alternative and renewable energy strategies, energy efficiency strategies, and transportation sector strategies. So take a look at those and then ask the panel about them later on. So Julia's going to start off.
Oops. Thanks. It's great to be here. So, I'll try to give you as much. I know journalists always have the thing we can offer up is the inside scoop. So I will offer up as much of that as I can in my remarks, and then I know we'll all be happy to take questions. And it's interesting because in many ways, for someone like myself who literally does two jobs, this is the best and the worst of times, because there are many days now on the campaign trail as I travel with John McCain where I get to write about both my beats in one story, which is dealing with energy and the environment and dealing with the presidential race. And the way that it is the worst of times is that basically what I'm writing about is two politicians who are adopting as furiously as they can policies that they think will help get them elected in order to ease the concerns of a panicky electorate. And that really is what I'm watching day after day, and I think the best example, in fact, is this week, or rather in the past, let's say, 7 days, where you've seen both Barack Obama change his position on offshore oil drilling to say that he would allow certain drilling and a certain amount of drilling in order to reach a compromise on energy in the Senate. And on top of that, he actually proposed what in many ways is a very sensible swap for taking light crude oil out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in exchange for taking more heavy crude in. And that, again, it was sort of pandering, but in actually a very sensible policy way. And then what I've seen covering John McCain, of course, is he has become more and more enthusiastic about drilling in order to boost domestic production, and in an effort and coupled with his proposal to provide a federal gas tax holiday for the summer, which, as we know, we're almost at the end of, so it's a little unclear when this gas tax holiday would occur, but he is very committed to it and talks about it every day. And what we're really seeing is these two politicians who in some instances may know better and in some instances may not, trying as hard as they can to address what is clearly an urgent concern by the men and women that they meet on the campaign trail every day. And it is really interesting to see this. We were in Aurora, Colorado, just in the last week, and a woman stood up and said, again, it's interesting, if several months ago, or certainly in previous elections, I heard citizens get up and say, we're choosing between our prescription drugs and feeding our families. And now they actually don't say that anymore, and instead they say, we're choosing between filling up our gas tanks and buying food for our families. And so that was the question. Her question to John McCain was, what are you going to do to change this? And his response was, well, I want to give you a gas tax holiday, but those mean Democrats in Congress aren't going to let that happen, and that's an example of how Washington is broken, and I want to drill now, and if we drill now, that's really going to ultimately translate into low gas prices. And the woman, interestingly enough, said, well, what are you going to do for me now? That's all well and good, but that's not going to change my situation tomorrow. And I think, in a way, this is a very interesting election because a lot of people consider that the presidential candidates are on trial as they go through this campaign, but I also think voters are subject to a test in terms of what issues do they choose as the important issues, what do they reward at the ballot box. And I think one of the really interesting things we're going to see is that for the first time in a long time, energy and the environment is ranking as one of the absolute top issues for men and women who are voting in this election. But are they thinking in a broad term or are they thinking in a narrow term? And that's what we're going to see. And when you look at how these two candidates are responding to this pressure that they're obviously seeing, that I think is very instrumental. And so I'll speak first about Obama and then about McCain. I think, what you're seeing with Obama is, interestingly, this is not an issue that he has not defined his career by issues of energy and the environment. He certainly has voted traditionally, with certain exceptions, with the environmental community. He has a League of Conservation voters lifetime record in the low 80s. I believe it's 83%. And so consistently, he's generally cast votes. But this has not been something that's been a top issue for him, although he certainly has talked about it more in recent months. And I think when you look at the positions he's taken, they generally, with some exceptions, are the traditional Democratic positions. Often, he's got a lot of senior advisors who have worked a long time on these issues. He talks to a lot of different scientists outside the Beltway who inform him on these issues. And again, when you look at something like what he's proposing with the Strategic Oil Reserve, it's basically modeling something on what Bill Clinton did, doing some tweaks, but that's basically where he ends up. And so in that way, his positions are fairly predictable. What's interesting about John McCain is his positions are utterly unpredictable. And this is very much in keeping with his record. He has a League of Conservation voting record in the low 20s for his lifetime. And what you'll see is, though he's been a champion on the issue of climate change, and I think as we've seen, he has a more modest plan than Obama on that issue. In most other issues, he generally has voted against the environmental community. And one of the things, and again, it depends, he's voted both ways on drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And again, with there's no particular rhyme or reason for how he votes on a given bill, although again, sometimes it depends on whether it's attached to a defense bill that he cares more about or things like that. What I think is most interesting about him is that when you look at the senior ranks of the McCain campaign, there's only one person who actually cares at all about the environment, and that is John McCain. And what is interesting about that is that when you look at how decisions are made, often it is him engaging in a dialogue with a group of advisors who really have and again, I speak to all of them on a regular basis, very little interest in these issues, period, except in terms of from the political lens of whether it will help us. For example, I talked to them about how they originally took a position on offshore oil drilling, which was a reversal from where John McCain stood in 2000 when he was running for president. And I talked to them and I said, well, how did you make that decision inside the campaign? And they said, well, we got a couple briefing papers from different people, and then we took it up to the political level. And I said, wow, okay, what was that discussion like when it was literally people whose names you may or may not have heard of, but Rick Davis, his campaign manager, Steve Schmidt, who's worked both for Dick Cheney and for Arnold Schwarzenegger, Charlie Black, a longtime Washington lobbyist. And I said, so what was the discussion about oil drilling? And one of them, and this is actually even on the record, said, well, we basically talked about whether Schwarzenegger and Christ would be mad at us. I mean, that was really our issue. The issue was whether, we would alienate these pro-environmental governors. And so, we kind of checked it out with them, and Chris was okay, and Schwarzenegger wasn't, and we were all in favor of it, so we did it. And so I think that and that gives you a sense of, honestly, how the decisions are being made. They actually had a more vibrant debate over the gas tax holiday, and I think that that's interesting, but there was kind of real discussion about whether that was economically a smart move. And so one thing that I find interesting covering McCain is that emotionally he is absolutely committed to certain issues, and he does care about climate change. And I think one of the things that John McCain, and Jim can talk about this, but deserves credit for is that, there's just no question that he stood up to his party on that issue, and that, in fact, he not only speaks about it literally every day on the campaign trail in public, but he speaks about it in Republican fundraisers where the audience is not necessarily, I had a very interesting, I was at in a home outside Denver just the other night covering a fundraiser in a home that was estimated to be worth between $10 and $14 million conservatively. A multimillionaire investor was his hope, and it was the host, and McCain was talking about climate change, and I was sitting with a bunch of oil executives from the Colorado area. And what's interesting is that what's funny is that they're investing in, say, geothermal and some other issues, so they're actually okay with his position. But again, he is willing to talk about it in front of oil executives as well as in front of swing voters, and so I think that that's important. But I think one of the really interesting things when you look forward and when voters are deciding is I think it is entirely unpredictable how he would govern on many of these issues, as I think we've seen in the campaign, simply that he has changed positions on certain issues. And obviously it will be, no matter who's elected president, it's going to be such a heavy lift in Congress to get something passed on a lot of these issues in light of what we actually just saw with the Senate vote in June on a climate change bill, which again, McCain basically was very similar to what McCain had backed and was sponsored by two of his closest allies in the Senate, which he actually ultimately opposed. So I think that we're just in a really interesting moment where it's going to be a test for both of these men as they go through, that they really are trying to speak to an urgent need. But the question is, how thought out are the positions that they're going to take, and how honest will they be in terms of conveying to Americans what very difficult decisions we will make. For example, both of them do talk about some of the tough choices, but Barack Obama talks much more explicitly about how there will be higher energy prices, and he has always been on record saying that he recognizes that energy prices will rise under any kind of meaningful climate change system that we adopt. That is not something that John McCain is willing to acknowledge. He consistently says that if we build as many nuclear power plants as he wants, then in fact it will be a painless transition. And so I think that those are some of the issues that voters are going to be sorting out in the months to come. And I'll turn it over to Jim.
Hi, Jim DePeso. I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and talk a little bit more about the politics and the philosophy behind why a Republican like John McCain is even interested in this issue. Well, in 2000, when our organization was in its infancy, we endorsed Senator McCain during his first campaign for president. And somehow, I don't know how we were able to swing this, we managed to arrange a 15-minute meeting with him at the airport in Phoenix. He was on his way home from New Hampshire, where he had won the primary, and he and his people agreed to meet with us at the airport in Phoenix. So after the initial pleasantries, the first statement out of his mouth in front of our top leaders was, "Everywhere I go, people are asking me about global warming. What do I do about global warming?" Well, basically it was a request for help. And so our people just kind of gulped and looked at each other and said, "Well, okay, Senator, we'll write a position paper for you, okay?" He said, "Fine, I'll expect it." So we wrote a position paper, or rather I wrote the position paper after I threw my kids off the computer and told them no games for several days. This is important. I guess now they believe it. Well, we like to think that we played a small role in helping John McCain become a national leader on climate change, but the more important point of the story is that this issue intrigued him as far back as 2000, when there was no political advantage in him taking this issue on, no advantage in him even showing any interest in the issue. Since then, he has done a great deal to make the case, perhaps more than any other member of Congress since 2000, that there needs to be a climate policy. And trust me, this is not popular within the Republican Party. We had some of our people go to the Texas State GOP convention. People came up to our booth there and seriously told our volunteers in Texas that global warming is caused by sunspots. So this is the sort of politics you have to deal with within the Republicans. So after McCain lost in 2000, he went back to the Senate. He held hearings in front of the Senate Commerce Committee with real scientists designed to elicit real information. These were not show hearings, which you sometimes get in D.C., as Juliet can attest to, where you trot out skeptics who have a pre-digested conclusion that's in line with a pre-existing political agenda. Of course, he and Joe Lieberman wrote their McCain-Lieberman bill, pressed for 2 Senate floor votes, and he took his congressional colleagues, including a few skeptics, literally to the ends of the earth, to show them global warming as it was happening here and now. Took them to Alaska, took them to Antarctica, took them to Greenland, and said, "Senator or Congressman, talk to the scientists yourself, see for yourself what's going on here." That's how you get stuff done in DC. You build support for legislation one senator at a time. Republican and Democrat, you work with them year after year, because something as big and as complicated as this takes time. It took 8 years to get the Wilderness Act passed when it was first introduced. That's how long it takes to get something big and complicated passed. Keep in mind that among many people today within the Republican Party who call themselves conservatives, there is a 4-level hierarchy of belief about climate change. Okay, level 1, global warming is not real because Al Gore made the whole thing up. Level 2, it might be real, but it's mostly natural. Sunspots, whatever. Level 3, well, it's probably real, and human activities might have something to do with it, but there's nothing we can do about it, or we'll wreck the whole economy. Level 4, well, we probably ought to do something about it, but let's wait for more research. Okay. Well, what's interesting about McCain's approach to this issue is that he dismisses this whole 4-step hierarchy of belief and reframes the issue in traditional conservative terms. And I want you to listen to me closely as I explain what I mean by traditional conservative. First, let me give you a quote from one of his speeches last year. I quote, "Some urge that we do nothing because we can't be certain how bad the problem might become, or they presume the worst effects are most likely to occur in our grandchildren's lifetime. I'm a proud conservative, and I reject that kind of live for today, me generation attitude." Now, what that touches on is an older sort of Tory conservatism that you don't hear about much today. In today's world, conservatism is equated with unlimited consumption and materialism and greed and on and on and on. But that's not really what traditional conservatism is all about. Any of you who are taking any political science ought to get a book called The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk, first written in the 50s, reprinted over many times. You can still get it at Amazon. Here's a quote from Russell Kirk's book. "In America, an impression began to arise that the new industrial and acquisitive interests are the conservative interest. That conservatism is simply a political argument in defense of large accumulations of private property. That expansion, centralization, and accumulation are the tenets of conservatives. From this confusion, the forces of tradition in the United States have never fully escaped." Well, you won't hear something like that from Rush Limbaugh. Trust me. This is the traditional conservatism of Edmund Burke, a British statesman of the 18th century who taught that society is an intergenerational contract in which the present generation has a duty to protect our inheritance on behalf of the future generation. This is a throwback to what Theodore Roosevelt was talking about. And when you push McCain to the wall and you ask him, who's your favorite conservative, he will say Theodore Roosevelt. Why? Theodore Roosevelt is often thought of as a progressive. Well, in some ways he was. In other ways, he's considered conservative because he was a conservative reformer. And one of his ideas was that we who are alive today have a duty that we owe to those to what he called within the womb of time, future generations. He wrote that in 1916. He was a very eloquent writer. And this is what McCain is getting at when he tells doubting Republicans in these town hall meetings that climate change is real, we ought to do something about it. There was an incident about a week or so ago, I don't know, maybe Juliet was even there, in Sparks, Nevada, outside of Reno. You were there. And one of the folks there said, oh, come on, what about all this global warming? What is it? What's up with that? Words to that effect. And McCain just basically said, my friends, climate change is real. That is a very difficult thing to say in front of Republican audiences. Let me tell you, the toughest Republican audience I ever spoke in front of was the Spokane Republican Women's Club. I have spoken in front of anarchists in Eugene. I have spoken in front of all kinds of groups that are wild. There was not a tougher group than the Spokane Republican Women's Club. And they asked me about global warming. And let me tell you, they did not like what I had to say. So this is a hard sell within the Republican and conservative community, because contemporary ideas about what is and isn't conservative are just part of our mental furniture. We accept them without any further reflection. Now, there may be ways to get around this. Now, polling results from Whit Ayers, who's a Republican pollster in D.C., advises Republican candidates to use a flanking maneuver. Get at this issue by talking about things like emphasizing the national security and economic benefits of a low-carbon economy. That might be a way that Republican candidates can get some traction, at least with independents, on this issue. But why does this matter? So what? So what if conservatives don't believe the science and they don't want to act? If they don't want to get on board, then next year just pass a bill. And if it's on a party line vote, then so be it. Well, you could do it that way. It might be tactically smart in the short term. In the long run, it would be strategically foolish. Deliberations on cap and trade will be much more than a wonky debate about exemptions and offsets and allowances, as important as that stuff is. This amounts to codifying a reordering of our energy economy that has been locked into a fossil fuel equilibrium for generations. Oops, turning the wrong page. Now, that fossil fuel energy economy has delivered mobility and technology and wealth on a scale that your great-great-grandparents could not have fathomed. It also gave us greenhouse gas emissions, but nobody thought about that when the first coal plants and gasoline and the first Model Ts rolled off the assembly line. And our friends in China and India and elsewhere want that mobility, they want that wealth, and they're prepared to burn a lot of coal to get it if they have to. So there's a great deal of inertia behind our fossil energy system because of these entrenched benefits. Finding new energy choices that will enable us to retain those benefits but also reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to the level that we need to reduce them is not going to be a trivial undertaking. You have a convergence of inequities. You have the systemic threat of global warming, which is quite real, and you have hundreds of millions of people in other countries seeking an escape from lifetimes and generations of poverty that you can't even imagine. This will take all of the moral, intellectual, and political capital that we can marshal to work our way through this. This will be a paradigm shift in this country similar to passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That law also was a codification of a reordering of social relations and racial attitudes that had been entrenched for lifetimes. In 1964, Democrats held both the White House and large majorities in Congress. President Johnson, however, and President Kennedy before him knew that a Civil Rights Act could not be passed without Republican support, namely the minority leader, Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois. Dirksen had very serious constitutional reservations about the Civil Rights Act. And the GOP caucus was not excited then, and they wouldn't be excited today, about helping a Democratic president achieve one of his top priorities. That's just politics in D.C. Dirksen was conservative, but he possessed a very canny pragmatism, a knack for working across the aisle. And he hit on a very clever strategy for working the Civil Rights Act and getting it through with minimal compromises. So on the day of the climactic vote that cut off what at the time was the longest filibuster in the history of the Senate, Dirksen rose in front of packed galleries. You couldn't, standing room only. And in his famously sonorous voice, some of the older folks in here may remember how Everett Dirksen had this wonderful voice. He said, "Stronger than all the armies is an idea whose time has come." And more than anyone else serving in Congress at that time, Everett Dirksen cleared the way for passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that reordering of deep-seated social relations. He brought along Republicans to join with Democrats in passing a bill that had to have bipartisan backing to achieve the broad, lasting social change that we today have witnessed in our lifetimes. Now, in 2009 and beyond, we will face a debate of that magnitude, a broad-scale reordering. And we as a nation will consider a bill that aspires to broad and lasting change, and we will need both Republicans and Democrats to cement the broad support that bill will have to pass and to be effective. We will need conservatives to get on board. They may have different ideas about how the bill should be structured and where the proper set point is in balancing the environment and the economy. But their support, however grudging and tentative, will be necessary to make this work. And that's the real benefit of John McCain's candidacy, is that he's telling Republicans, using this traditional conservative language, that we really have to own up to our moral responsibilities. He's telling them that climate stewardship is an idea whose time has come. And if he's elected, he will be best positioned to push some of those Republicans, many of them no doubt kicking and screaming and wailing and gnashing their teeth, across the finish line to vote for a bill, which will be a compromise. The climate bill will be a negotiation, as the Civil Rights Act was. If McCain does not prevail, and I hope that Barack Obama will be wise enough to realize that winning the fight against global warming will require both conservatives and progressives to see that as a victory for our country. So thank you.
I guess I'm next.
You're next, Mike.
I'm next. My name is Mike, and it is my privilege to represent Bozeman's downtown district. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's always an honor to be invited to speak, assuming you folks think I have something worth listening to. I wanted to not speak about so much the presidential candidates, but speak about how their work has a meaning to Montana and what Montana's legislature can do to assist a President McCain or a President Obama. So I'm going to bring this discussion to a more local level, to the Montana level, but I'd like to start by telling you the story when I saw my first polar bear back in 1982. For a period of time while waiting to establish my research camp, I was conducting research on grizzly bears in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in anticipation of oil and gas development. I was stationed in the Eskimo village of Kaktovik. I remember one day when a buzz went through the village because a polar bear had been seen feeding on a whale carcass about 100 meters offshore. The bear was big and white, as polar bears are, and tattooed. Old number 93 was well known to the polar bear research team, not because he was an extraordinary bear, but because he was part of a long-term ongoing study of the species ecology. Through useful studies that have generated reliable knowledge, we know a great deal about polar bears. They're absolutely fascinating animals that, now get this, navigate, probably without air, a landscape that's forever changing as the sea ice floats about the pole. They're wildly successful predators. How else can you account for their large body size? They truly lead lives of magnitude in the harshest of environments. And soon they'll be extinct because pack ice is disappearing at an increasing and alarming rate due to climate change. Now, who would have thought that the ultimate canary in a coal mine would be the largest terrestrial carnivore in the far north? I approach climate change and energy policies from the perspective of a wildlife biologist who spent the last nearly 30 years working in the field of restoration ecology, first with the Department of Interior, mostly with large carnivores. About 11 years ago, Ted Turner and I went forward together, launched the Turner Endangered Species Fund, quite simply an effort to restore imperiled plants, birds, fishes, mammals. With time, my work with Ted began to focus on energy issues because climate change is fast becoming a major driver of species endangerment. Also because of that, during the last few years, I actively sought and eventually gained election to the Montana legislature to increase my opportunity to contribute to efforts to redress climate change through passage of progressive energy policies. There is no doubt, the science is very clear. Climate change is real, the pace of change is quickening, and the effects are increasingly widespread and disastrous. Montana has by no means been spared. The universities here at U of M, our own Nobel laureate, Steve Running, has assembled a notable data set describing important trends that Montanans should be interested in. For example, in Montana, over the last 30 years, average temperatures from March have increased by 6 to 7 degrees Celsius, causing earlier snowmelt. 6 to 7 degrees. That is a shift unheard of in ecological sciences. Montana is facing increasingly devastating droughts due to significant increases in these temperatures without a sufficient increase in precipitation to offset those hotter days. Wildfires, over 1,000 acres in size, have increased 40% over the last 30 years. They're going to become more common and more durable. Steve's best climate models, all of you in Missoula should find this interesting. The best climate models indicate Missoula will get no snow in 50 years. The best climate models indicate that in 50 years, our coolest years will be hotter than our hottest years now. Like nearly every place I know of in the world, Montana is ground zero for climate change. Despite this pressing urgency, climate change has been a very difficult issue for the Montana legislature. We have not had a useful discussion on the issue, let alone have we developed a roster of policies that would complement the campaign positions of Senators McCain or Obama, let alone complement the important work that one of these fellows will do as president. Now, I think there are several reasons why the issue's been difficult for us. You need to know the reasons because you can help us overcome the difficulties. For example, first, it's difficult because for those legislators who are willing to work on the problem while it can still be solved, they won't enjoy any benefits. Dick Barrett when he wins, Ron Erickson when he wins, when I win, and we work on this issue, we won't enjoy the rewards. There's tremendous inertia to the climate system. No matter what we do tomorrow, We're on a certain path of climate, a certain path of weather patterns that will persist for the next many decades. Nothing that we can do will change that. We're fundamentally talking about passing policies tomorrow that might make life a bit better 40 or 50 years from now. That's hard for a legislator to accept that kind of timeline. It's difficult for us because the scale of human activities that cause the problem are very hard to understand. For example, how in the world can a volunteer citizen legislator possibly appreciate the number of internal combustion engines on the road worldwide every day spewing forth carbon? How can I appreciate the number of fires burning in the rainforest to clear another patch for agriculture? How in the world can I appreciate the number of widgets made day after day after day worldwide? The scale, the breadth and depth of the daily human enterprise is nearly incomprehensible. And yet it's that enterprise that causes this problem. The issue is difficult for us in Montana because the scale of the problem itself defies our understanding. The activities are tough to get our arms around, but so is the problem. The biosphere seems to stretch on forever, certainly across a space that is too big and too fluid for us to have ruined, or conversely, it stretches across a space that is too big and too fluid for us to repair. The issue is difficult because legislators get confused by the piles of literature on the issue, because they don't seem to distinguish between several categories of information. For example, most of my colleagues in Helena are apparently unaware of the rigor that attends the assembly of peer-reviewed scientific publications. So they take those publications along with lay and gray literature, assuming the technical materials referred to at all, and they lump them all together and afford them all the same degree of respect. And yet we know that an article in the Missoulian that looks at the relationship between energy and climate change is not assembled with the same scholarship that would attend a similar article in the peer-reviewed journal Conservation Biology. The issue is difficult for us because many Montana legislators simply don't believe that the climate is changing in a notable manner. And for those that do believe the climate is changing, they don't believe it's changing because of human activities. The issue is difficult because for many Montana legislators, you're going to love this one, at least they'll acknowledge that there's a problem, and they'll acknowledge that progressive energy problems can contribute to a solution, but they still resist doing anything. Because they say, our contribution is so slight, and overall, Montana contributes about 0.6% of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions originate in Montana. So they say, our contribution is so very slight, and the problem is so very large, that the need for federal action trumps the need for any state action. If that's not a cop-out, I don't know what is. And finally, the idea is difficult because the design of our legislative process, the design of your legislative process, which is far from ideal, isolates knowledge, authority, and influence, and thus perpetuates a herd mentality that squashes boldness and innovation among the rank and file of both parties. People just follow along. So with all of those difficulties, what can we do to overcome them? Because unless we overcome the difficulties, we will not be able to help President McCain. We will not be able to help President Obama. And if we're going to overcome the difficulties, y'all must help us do that. So here are some ideas that we got to get our arms around to improve on our performance. First, at least senior members of both parties must master the science of climate change sufficiently to understand the stakes involved and summon the clarity of mind and depth of will to act wisely. A handful of people have to step up. Secondly, we have to recognize that a state climate action plan, your climate action plan, as manifest by a tapestry of progressive energy policies, is the linchpin connecting other very important issues, including the environment, the economy, and national security. I believe that climate change and related energy policies are the great connective issues of the 21st century. The plan for Montana must remove carbon from our energy system very quickly. To develop the plan, we've got to cut through a bewildering array of policy choices that range from market-based solutions to full use of the police powers of the state to mandate changes. Regardless of the final contents of the plan, it has to join liberals and conservatives in ways that are fair, pragmatic, and long-lasting. Otherwise, it's just so many words. To overcome the difficulties, we've got to recognize that our state energy policy will occupy a cornerstone in the national energy policy because Montana contains 25% of the nation's coal. You know, when the California Assembly and Governor Schwarzenegger talk, the energy markets and presidential candidates listen because they govern the world's 5th largest economy. Well, when the Montana legislature talks and Governor Schweitzer talks, the energy markets and the presidential candidates listen because we govern 1/4 of the nation's coal. To do better, and Dick can speak to this later, we have to institute a new means for accounting for all of the costs of production, distribution, and consumption. Quite simply, we need to consistently consider both positive and negative externalities. Do y'all know what a negative externality is? It's really quite simple. In any economic transaction, if somebody gets put upon and doesn't get paid, they get screwed in the deal, so to speak. That's a negative externality. A classic example is secondhand smoke. You contract lung cancer because of secondhand smoke, but you never got paid for it. We need a system that accounts for both the good things and the bad things of the economic transitions that define the world. To do this, one way is to embrace ecological economics, which is simply a subset of neoclassical economics, which takes into account the impact of human activities on the planet's living systems. The fundamental notion of ecological economics is really quite simple, and it is that human welfare so utterly depends on ecosystem services that we need to be fastidious in our accounting of any damage we do to those systems that provide those services. Finally, to do better, we've got to rise above the divisions of right and left, conservative and liberal, and stake out higher common ground. You know, I believe, and I'm biased, but nonetheless, I believe that when you get right down to it, we're all environmentalists. We all desire clean water and good clean food and good clean place to live and good work. All of those things require healthy landscapes. And I mean landscape in the broadest sense of the word. And in my mind, an environmentalist is just somebody that fights for the health of landscapes. Overcoming all of the shortcomings of the Montana legislature to help McCain or Obama is a very tall order, but it's an order that we must fill. We have ample reason to believe that we have only a few years, maybe a decade or two, to enact progressive energy policies before we are fully committed to notable climate-induced global changes that promise to be decidedly more negative than positive. I believe that you can now make the case that the world relies on today fossil fuels not because they're better or cheaper than renewable fuels, but because of past governmental policies and investment decisions. Breaking this pattern, breaking the status quo, is going to require ambitious, forward-looking policies that account for these negative externalities and drive demand for renewable fuels. Montana has notable potential to be a leader in the development of such policies. It's my hope that the state's legislators from both parties can come together to recognize this potential. If that hope is satisfied, then Montana can do much to assist President McCain or President Obama with efforts to honor their campaign promises to curb and eventually reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. For the Montana legislature to do well, you guys have to get involved. Make sure you elect folks like Dick Barrett and Ron Erickson, and then provide the support that they inevitably will require. A friend of mine, one of the country's great environmentalists, a guy named David Brower. David died a few years ago. We were together on a panel many, many years ago entitled Restoring the Earth. And David remarked that politicians are like weather vanes and our job is to make the wind blow. Thank you.
I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to try to be very brief because I want to open up the floor for discussion and hear from all of you before we have to end. And in the interest of full disclosure, I am an Obama supporter. I was elected an Obama delegate at the county level in Seattle before moving recently to Washington, D.C. One of my institutions, the Center for American Progress, is run by John Podesta, who has been named the transition team director for a future Obama administration should it occur. So there's where my loyalties lie. That said, of course, and especially today, I must say, listening to Jim, I'd be more than happy to work with the McCain or Obama administration on climate change issues for all the reasons that people have said. It is, I think, the great moral challenge of our time. What I want to do is, first of all, just share with you a little bit of data that leads to the conclusion I'm going to pick for why, for one of the reasons that I worry about the future of this issue, which are quite similar to some of the issues that Mike just brought up. One of the projects I'm working on with Ed Maybach, who's the head of the George Mason Center for Climate Change Communication, and Tony Leishowitz, who is the head of the Yale Forestry School project on climate change, is basically we're trying to build on some data that originates with Tony, really confirming and extending some analysis he's done that shows that the strongest correlation between the public's attitudes on climate change is not political party, it's not income, it's not race, it's not gender, it's not any other sort of measure of social stratification, but it's what we would refer to as your moral framework. The kinds of things that we've sort of seen come out recently in some of the debates about by George Lakoff, for example, on American politics. And what I mean by moral framework is for philosophers, a fairly crude but still informative, I think, for the purposes of public policy measure of whether or not someone counts as a hierarchicalist or an egalitarian or some of these other sort of big, broader moral frameworks. And if you ask people, if you sort of measure their attitudes on what they think their obligations are to other persons on a range of other issues that have nothing to do with climate change, then you ask them a host of questions about climate change, this is the strongest correlation. And so what we're trying to do, building on this research, is to first of all measure where we are with the public on climate change. And I think we're in a much better position than people have thought we've been before for various reasons. I'm happy to talk about that later. And then also figure out where do we need to go. So the three gaps that we've sort of focused on, and that I'm just going to briefly mention now are three. The urgency gap, how quickly must we act on climate change? A temporal gap, when will things start to go wrong, and then consequently, how quickly do we need to act? And then a spatial gap. Who will be hurt by climate change? And in terms of an assessment of the harm, then how do we sort of feel that should sort of inform our political decisions? So now this is the slide, and this has sort of been interesting from a study that Tony did in 2006. So I'm going to compare summer 2006 data and summer 2007 data. This was done from a study that was basically comparing people who watched An Inconvenient Truth, right, excluding people who are already predisposed to believe what Gore was saying in Inconvenient Truth, measured against the general public. So don't pay attention to the blue lines, because those are the off-the-scale people who were persuaded by Gore, not important for today's discussion so much, but just look at the baseline data of where people were in 1996. So in terms of the question, or the statement, life on Earth will continue without major disruptions only if we take immediate and drastic action. So this is urgency to reduce global warming. And just pay attention to here, 20% here in terms of now. Now the next slide is an empty set, but that's because we're missing a macro on this computer, so it doesn't show you the data. But trust me, there was an improvement. I put it on, I originally composed it on a Mac. So in 2007, there was a 10% jump. Not because these people then went and watched An Inconvenient Truth, but just there was a 10% jump. So from 20 to 30% claiming now, and then even better in terms of the sort of the next category in. If we look at the temporal gap, when do you think global warming will start to have dangerous impacts on people around the world? 2006 again, 20% here, 19% in 10 years, and then on down the line. And this becomes very important in terms of how we understand these goals, 80% reductions below 1990 levels by 2050, et cetera. How much time do we have to act? And then, please, if you saw this one, you'd see another 10% jump. Now this is, and I promise you, I can produce these statistics. the important thing is just in 1 year, we hear this a lot with a lot of sort of national surveys. The Times has done some of these surveys that have been give us a reason not to hope in the past, because you sort of look at, especially around election time, what are people's voting priorities? You know, war on terror, economy, things like this, and the environment winds up at the bottom of most of these. And so the worry is that despite all the public education, despite really, I think the death of the diehard climate skepticism, public position at least, as any kind of legitimate position, then the worry is that we're really not making progress. But my view is that that's really skewed data. That what accounts for that is only recently have we seen a major piece of legislation finally make it to a floor vote. And so that people were mobilized to actually get in touch with their legislators to talk and lobby on climate change. If we look at just the sort of the straightforward polling that's been done of people on the ground without sort of comparing it to these other issues, we see that there is improvement. And finally, one more, and you can't see this one, but unfortunately there's still a spatial gap. So if we look at some kind of analysis of where people think that climate change is going to impact, who is it going to impact first? Fundamentally, people think it's going to happen to plants and animals, and then, you know, for some people the polar bear is motivating, for others it's not, and that's an unfortunate truth. And then as we get sort of further along, we think that climate change is going to affect people in other countries first, and that's a problem. And then sort of the lowest sort of numbers have to do with people sort of saying that climate change is going to impact them first. So the reason that I think this is important, the urgency gap, and Mike did a fantastic job, I think, of reinforcing this, is that the politicians, the elected officials who are going to sort of take office now are not going to be rewarded by the actions that they're going to take, at least not immediately. This will be something that will wait into the future. And this does demand new leadership. And I put up this picture of Kevin Rudd, who is the new Prime Minister of New Zealand.
Australia.
Oh, sorry, of Australia. Sorry for those.
The Aussies in the
Any Australians in here?
Right, sorry, of Australia. Kevin Rudd elected last year, and within 3 hours of taking office, signs Kyoto. And this is largely symbolic, right? Because there's no way that Australia is now going to meet its Kyoto goals within the next year before we start negotiating the successor to the Kyoto Protocol in Copenhagen in 2009. But I was in Bali last December for the UN Framework Climate Change meetings, and there were a couple rock star moments at that meeting. One was certainly when Gore showed up and basically shamed the United States for holding up progress on the Bali Agreement that was being negotiated then, which was the roadmap to the next agreement, the next major treaty the UN will negotiate. Another one was when Kevin Rudd entered the meeting. And Australia had been dragging its feet and had been, you know, in the skeptic camp and had been one of those few nations that had held up progress. And for Kevin Rudd to come forward and show that finally Australia was joining the concern of the world of nations and showing this leadership was fundamentally important for giving Australia new legitimacy, despite the fact that they will not meet their expectations under Kyoto, to really help to shape the next agreement and move forward and show the world leadership and hopefully get China and India to come along and also take more responsibility in the next treaty. And this is why I think leadership is fundamentally important. The Montana legislature has to step up to the plate for exactly the reasons that Mike said, but they cannot do it alone. No state legislature can. This requires national leadership to take the progress that has been made in the states, in the Western Climate Initiative, the Northeastern Climate Initiative, and the Midwestern Climate Initiative, bring those together to create a national, what will most likely be a cap and trade system. Why I am worried about John McCain, for all of the virtues, and I will be the first to admit of the virtues that John McCain, the leadership he's shown on this particular issue. I was very disappointed in his position and frankly Clinton's position on the gas tax holiday last summer. I worry about the message that sends alongside the message that we have about, you know, taking this issue seriously and moving forward with it. More importantly than that, and also the drilling issue, though we've seen where Obama's come along, as Juliet has reminded us on the offshore drilling issue. More importantly than that, what I worry about is that this may take a much harder hit than we've thought. There's 3 indicators that have come around recently, and I'll just remind us of. Jim Hansen, the most important climate scientist, certainly in the public sphere right now, from NASA, came out recently with a paper claiming that our target should be 350 parts per million, right? That should be our target. And the way that he puts this is like caustic for a scientist. I mean, for Jim Hansen to come out on a limb and sort of say, we're at 383 or so now, we need to go down to 350, that's got to be our goal, because otherwise we're entering a climate that in which human culture had never evolved or sort of been stabilized in before. Rajendra Pachauri, the head of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, claiming shortly before the Bali conference last December, we have a 5-year window of opportunity, right, to begin to take the steps we need to reduce greenhouse gases. And then the increasing chorus of scientists who are saying 60% cuts below 1990 levels are not sufficient, 80% cuts below 1990 levels by 2050 are not sufficient, and pushing it forward upwards to we need 100% cuts, right, below 1990 levels of emissions by 2050. This will require a great deal of leadership to take that up. And when John McCain claims that this will not, that the transition to that economy that represents those kinds of targets will not cost us anything, I worry. When Barack Obama says it will cost us, and in fact, this is the challenge that we have to step up to the plate for, then I have more hope. Because he's already admitting that this is going to be difficult, that this is going to be the moral calling of our generation that we are going to have to live up to. So what I worry about, with all due respect to everything Jim has said, is that when President John McCain takes office, and the economists who know what's going to go on, right, Dick? The economists come into the room and say, here's what it's going to cost, here is, the hit we're going to have to take. What I'm worried about is that someone who has said we will not have to take a hit is going to then go before the American people and change his public message on this. That's what I'm worried about. Now, again, I would be more than look forward to working with President McCain and shore up his moral courage to do what I think he can do. But I'm at this point more hopeful that a President Obama will go ahead and move forward with pushing us to appeal to the better angels of our nature and to do what we have to do to meet this problem. So thank you.
The floor is now open for anyone to question anybody. So please direct your question to someone. Ron?
Question for Juliet. Because you spent so much time with Senator McCain. This yellow sheet gives for both people the idea that we can help with global warming, climate change, with something called clean coal.
Yeah.
Clean coal might be an oxymoron to start with, but what I'm particularly concerned with is what does Senator McCain think clean coal is, and how it's connected to climate change. And after, since Juliet's written a lot, I asked her first, but it might be that anybody wants to speak then to what Senator Obama thinks clean coal is.
I mean, I don't think that either candidate has really specified, what that means beyond saying that they're in favor of carbon sequestration, that they essentially would support any technology and would be willing to give government money towards a plant that would sequester carbon dioxide emissions in the processing of coal. Obama just announced yesterday that he would support 5 demonstration projects specifically to build, quote unquote, clean coal power plants. So that I don't think they really have gotten into the nitty gritty. It's something that, again, both of these candidates emphasize, particularly when they're in coal producing states such as Montana as well as Kentucky. And the only observation that I make on clean coal technology is that my mother worked at the Department of Energy for years providing federal contracts for various initiatives, and I was in elementary school when she came home cursing about the boondoggles of federal money going to clean coal technology projects, which were not working in the 1970s, and we will see whether they work, in the future. But everyone talks about this as something that they see as a really important issue. If you talk to, for example, Jim Rogers, the CEO of Duke Energy, he would say that technology will not come online until 2020, if not 2025.
And in this state, clean coal is talked about that way, but it's also talked about in terms of coal to diesel fuel. And coal to diesel fuel gives us nothing at all in terms of...
Senator Obama used to be in favor of coal to liquids, and he has renounced that position. He specifically, as a senator, endorsed it and has backed away from it. And McCain, to my knowledge, hasn't really addressed it one way or another.
No, it really isn't.
But Ron, as you can appreciate, and I'm assuming there are many Montana voters in this room. Am I right? That's good. If you're not, y'all should register. We should have cards, As candidates, we should have. But nonetheless, our governor speaks well of clean coal. He speaks well of liquefaction. And Ron's point, y'all understand that when you have a liquid fuel and you burn it in a vehicle, you still have emissions from the tailpipe. So even if you get a fuel from coal from a plant, and the plant sequesters all of the carbon, but then you burn that fuel in a car, there's emissions there. The best one can hope for liquefaction is that it reduces your dependence on liquid fuels from politically unstable regions of the world. And there may be value in that. And y'all realize there's one vehicle that needs a liquid fuel that's fairly light, and that's an airplane. You're hard pressed to run a plane on electricity. And your military aircraft are important, and so maybe there's something the military needs to do. But do you all understand, our government, our federal government, just canceled Future Gen. It was one of the plants that was supposed to be the cutting edge effort to say, can we really develop coal in a manner that's carbon neutral? And for a price tag of $2 billion, you know what they did? They canceled it because they said it was too expensive. Now, last time I looked, our price tag in Iraq was $10 to $12 billion a month. And it seems to me we're sort of putting these issues in the wrong order. And you have to ask yourself, as Montana voters, do you want Montana's coal exploited? The governor just spoke excitedly of a new contract to increase Montana coal development by 33%. Not to burn it here, but rather to dig it out of the ground and ship it off. And maybe that's a fine plan. And on this, the governor and I agree. You can't stick your head in the ground on coal and simply say no coal, no way, no how. Because China and India are going to use coal, and we're best positioned to lead the edge on research and development so that they don't bury us in climate-altering pollution.
I wanted to add one more thing, and the reason why Senators Obama and McCain are talking about clean coal, although they're not defining it very definitively, is there's one number that you all need to keep in mind for this election, and that is 270. That's how many electoral votes you need to win. Pennsylvania has 21, Ohio has 20, Illinois has 21, and all the coal states, they all add up. In order to get 270, you need to assemble a coalition of constituencies who will vote for you. And that's one of the reasons why they're both talking about coal.
In the transportation sector, it seems that both candidates are saying we'll still drive everywhere for everything, we'll just change the fuel. And except for Obama, who says we'll encourage local planning for transit, etc. Well, we've seen a 20% increase in transit ridership in Missoula last month, and people are, even to the point of danger, riding bicycles a lot more around Missoula. Is there anything behind here that's not on the sheet that they have any recognition that so-called other transportation options deserve a major?
Alex, let me just say that I prepared the sheet, and that notation under Obama used federal transportation funding to encourage local planning for bicycle. It's a far more articulated position than that, and I would encourage everybody to go to both of these websites to see more about it. But I can say that yes, there is more articulation of this policy in Obama's policy statement that you see here. Now, maybe others have more to add.
Part of the issue with transportation is that in many ways, the development of highways and transit systems are state and local judgments. And it would be very difficult and probably undesirable for the federal government to tell individual communities, you shall do certain things with transit and highways. I would be uncomfortable with that. But what you can do is prevail upon Congress to maybe alter the formula in the, every 6 years the transportation bill is passed. It's pretty highway intensive. Fellows like Ted Stevens and Don Young keep it that way. Prevail upon the Congress to have a broader share of funding for transit, locally planned transit projects, maybe a little bit less for $400 million bridges to nowhere. So again, this is again a political negotiation.
But if you want to, I would say just a couple things on this. First of all, if you look at their records, Senator Obama has supported alternative transit measures more than Senator McCain, and I've talked to McCain about this, and he actually has just begun to engage in this issue this year and had not really focused on it. And I think part of it is if you look at Phoenix, you can see, they're not big subway riders, for example. And you're right, that was a joke, obviously. But my point is, he comes from an area where long commutes in cars is not an unusual thing, and frankly had never engaged until actually we were at a kind of a little policy forum outside of Seattle, where for the first time he actually said, really, some people, they can commute other ways, and how would that affect it? And he actually said maybe, and he literally said, I was there, he said, maybe the federal government should encourage that, when in fact, again, this debate comes up every time the highway bill is engaged. But so it is something that I think he's looking at for the first time. I think that this is one of these issues where either candidate would be having to do something that is different from what voters want, because Americans are very committed to long individual commutes. And again, obviously high gas prices are changing this, and this may be a moment where the government can reorient itself. Also, again, McCain is very much, he talks frequently about being a federalist, and he believes that these are decisions that local communities and states should make, and he does not believe in kind of wielding a heavy stick of the federal government in the way that I think Obama has indicated he would be more comfortable with.
Although I would add to that if you look at these policy proposals, also Obama's proposals in the area of energy efficiency, they don't necessarily involve a sort of a heavily regulatory approach towards local and state government. They involve lots of funding mechanisms, incentives, and mechanisms of that kind. So they're not highly interventionist.
There's a fellow in the back with a question, but I want to ask this fellow that asked the last question a question. You mentioned that Missoula saw a notable increase in the use of the transit system recently. Is that right?
Yes,
And why do you think there was an increase?
$4 a gallon gas.
So let me ask y'all in the room, and I first bumped into this idea with Tom Friedman wrote, why not legislation that would ensure that gas is never cheaper than $4 a gallon? It's still heavily subsidized at $4 a gallon, but the federal government puts a floor on it. Now, would you support it? And do you think McCain or Obama could get elected on it?
If you took the equivalent of $4 a gallon gas off of some other tax we pay, yes, why not? If you switch it, if you take down the employment tax, you take down some income tax, something, but you give everybody the money back, they still have to pay for gas, but they're not economically harmed.
But if you did that, the point is that the cost of gas now is high enough that it influences your decision. It hurts a bit to buy gas, so you ride the bus. And it's got to hurt to change your behavior. And the federal government could make it hurt, so to speak, but more importantly, make you aware of the true cost of a gallon of gas. When you count all of the subsidies, a gallon of gas really probably costs $7 or $8 a gallon. And one idea I had was to pass a law in Montana that would have a placard placed on every gas pump that would say, oh, gee whiz, by the way, just thought you might be interested. We're going to charge you $3 a gallon, but the true cost is $7.58, and here's where you can find how we calculated that amount. Just thought you'd like to know. Because all of these free market economists that speak about free markets never bothered to tell you that the consumer's really hoodwinked, because you don't know what the true price of most of the items you buy really is. So I fail to see, Dick, what constitutes a free market when there are so many perverse subsidies in the system. Anyway, the fellow in the back.
Actually, this follows right on that, which is that a lot of this claim that a more efficient and possibly equitable response to climate change is a carbon tax as opposed to a cap and trade system. It's easier to implement, it may have much lower transaction costs, but yet there's no traction for that type of mechanism in DC, or I would assume in Montana as well, simply because it has the four-letter word tax in it. You end this as just all forward. Do you see any possible mechanisms by which carbon tax, or let's call it a carbon fee, could actually be viable in a political setting by either DC or here in Montana, specifically as it's already hard upon, but offsetting maybe income tax or offsetting other property taxes? I mean, what else would have to happen to get a more carbon tax as opposed to cap and trade system implemented?
It would take something as dramatic as what you just suggested, that the federal government said we're now going to sort of stop taxing income and we're going to tax carbon instead, and then that won't happen.
Do you think that's a good thing?
Do I think it's a good thing to do a carbon tax instead of a cap and trade? Absolutely. I agree with you for all the reasons that you suggested. I think it's fair. I think it's easier to implement. I think that the hurdles involved in a national cap and trade system that actually works are going to be enormous. I believe that an agency that's going to implement, that first of all is going to do the inventories that are going to be necessary to then decide how we're going to start the auctions, and all of that is going to be very, very difficult. It's going to require an agency that has the reach and strength of something akin to, Homeland Security. That's going to have to be that powerful to actually be reliable and actually get us where we need to go. And of course, this just raises the burden, but that's where we are for the reasons you said. A tax is not going to work. Chris Dodd was the only presidential candidate who was openly endorsing a carbon tax, and not viable. And let me say this: there's a flip side which is perverse. And one of the things that I'm going to be doing in the fall at the Center for American Progress is actually trying to track this and trying to get other reporters to take this issue up, which is that if we look at some of the really regressive and the ones that Republican think tanks or conservative think tanks, the ones that I know that Jim does not support, have started espousing a carbon tax publicly, and for all the right reasons. I mean, if you listen to the message, carbon tax is fair and better to implement, and all these reasons. And I think they're doing it quite cynically, because if we can sort of promote this, then it provides a reason, right, for people to actually vote for and to put carbon tax legislation on the floor of the House or the Senate, which will never, ever get through. And this is just going to further delay moving to the cap and trade system that we need. And it's not just the think tanks. There are individual members of Congress who've been promoting carbon tax over a cap and trade, people who in the past have been climate skeptics, who have been against, Congress taking this legislation. And I don't think they've just suddenly seen the light. I think they see this as a new tactic. So that's what I'm quite worried about, that will then become, the next kind of iteration of some form of skepticism under another name.
Ron Erickson served on Montana's tax committee in the House for many years, now running for the Senate. Ron, could you briefly, what would you see as the hurdles in Montana for us to propose a carbon tax and an alleviation of homeowner tax? Property taxes, homes or...
They're simply not comparable. This idea that we're going to work on this tax over here versus this one over here. Most of the people in this room, maybe proportionally, don't pay property tax. They rent. Income tax is, totally different from whether or not you're wealthy versus whether you're poor. Gas tax and energy tax are just things you have to do to live day by day. So I don't think that you're going to have a real good way to get rid of another tax. Rather, you could use the revenue from the carbon tax and give it back to people who are in most need. So you could make it progressive, but I don't think that you would change other taxes. You would have to find a way to help the people to be able to pay their power bills or to pay their mass transit bills. And could we ever do that in Montana? No.
I want to argue with the contention that economists are unanimous on the preferability of a tax
certainly
to a cap and trade system. I am an economist and I'm not in favor of that. I believe that actually cap and trade does have one very significant advantage, which is that you know how much capping you'll get. With a tax, you don't know how much capping you get. You know where you set the tax, and you do not know how the system is going to respond. And the information requirements that you're going to have to set the tax to get the response you want are comparable to the information requirements that you're going to need if you have a tax, and if you have a tax and or if you have a cap and trade system, and you have to do all this inventorying and so forth. So I think the information requirements are comparable, and I think again, on the issue, a very important question is whether or not you auction the allowances or give them away. But if you auction the allowances, that generates the same kind of revenue that Ron's talking about the tax generates, and which can be used in a variety of constructive ways, including in Obama's ideal world, he's going to spend tens of billions of dollars on efficiency measures, alternative fuels, and so forth and so on. So you can generate revenue with the cap and trade system. You have certainty of effect, and so I'm one economist at any rate that doesn't agree either with all these other economists or apparently with Andrew.
It's not going to happen anyway. So.
I guess the fellow in the black shirt.
I have two questions for Juliet, and the first one would be, so if none of McCain's advisors care about the environment, why, does that reflect on him? How come he doesn't have an advisor who cares or is knowledgeable about the environment? And that's what I thought I'd heard. And the second would be a little bit of a longer question with the media bearing responsibility for the public's awareness of climate change and the complexities involved. And so my question to that to you is, what percentage of the questions to let's say McCain or Obama are centered on climate change? 5% of the question, when reporters are I don't know if it works that way, but how much of the time spent with the candidates are reporters trying to direct questions to them? And then can reporters follow up with these candidates and, kind of put their feet to the fire a bit? Hey, that was a vague answer. Could you please? Or why don't you have something on your website? And where are you getting that from? And how come you really don't have that? And just not let them kind of vague out of the question.
All right, I want to take the first question first, particularly because I think Jim might be able to speak to it too in his position. I think that this frankly shows just, again, that McCain is different from your average Republican. Now, one of the issues is his top advisors tend to be very politically strategic. They're strategists, and so they're not as steeped in policy anyway, but the fact of the matter is there's no reason, David Axelrod and David Plouffe, who are the top strategists for Obama, neither of them are climate change and environmental advocates either. The fact is that they happen to hold positions which are more in line with, again, where their candidate is and where that party is. And I think, and again, I would be interested in what Jim says to this, but I think it really is much more a reflection of the fact that McCain remains, to some extent, in the minority of the Republican Party and his position on this. So it's...
Yeah, there is not a whole lot of intellectual capital within the Republican Party today regarding climate policy, okay? And McCain really is an outlier. Juliet knows this better than I do. Campaigns are more like organized chaos, and getting messages through to the right people can take some effort. We have a guy in D.C. who's over at the campaign headquarters 2 or 3 times a week working with them, and it's time consuming. But I'll let Juliet answer the second question.
And the second question, and because Andrew is perhaps the most voracious consumer of political media that I know in the entire world, he might be able to speak to this as well. But there's a lot of rap that that actually the media hasn't given a hard time to either candidate, actually, whether it's Obama and McCain. And obviously, I will speak to the McCain side. I don't know what the percentages are. I certainly ask him a lot on both climate change and other energy issues, and I can tell you that yesterday the only thing that reporters were asking him about was gas policy and oil and drilling and things like that. It's certainly a significant, I would put it this way, there are infinitely more questions asked about climate change, energy, and the environment than healthcare on the campaign, without question. And you know, part of that is, you know, I would say that one of the regular Wall Street Journal reporters is their healthcare expert. So it's not like there aren't reporters who don't know to talk about that. We're generally asking them on the issues that are the focus. And again, I certainly have a parochial interest. What I will say, and again, I would argue this is actually a distinction between McCain and Obama. McCain enjoys getting into a back and forth, whether it's with voters or whether it's with reporters. And I frequently challenge him. And frankly, several times he'll say, I defer to you, which is not generally what candidates say when reporters are asking them questions. But I scrutinize his policy on nuclear. I scrutinize his caps. We talk about allowances, you know, again, not in great depth because he doesn't really have a detailed policy on allowances. But when, you know, he is more than willing to go back and forth and have a real dialogue. That is not something that Obama frequently does. And in terms of how the whole media is covering it, you know, I don't know if Andrew has any other information. Okay.
So, I mean, I would only say there is this recent movement that you were telling me about. So
That MoveOn.org is pushing.
MoveOn.org is going to start pushing, or has started pushing, for the major media outlets especially to be assigning more reporters like Juliet, people who are investigative reporters or beat reporters who work on some of these policy issues, rather than people who just know political strategy to start covering the campaign. Political strategy guys, if you read Washington Post and you sort of see what, you know, stories Juliet focuses on, what stories some of the other reporters who cover McCain or Obama focus on, it really does change that, you know, some reporters are just interested in the political strategy issues, the machinations of that, because that's what they know, right? And so I think this is probably one case where making MoveOn's cut it right.
It fell on the blue t-shirt
Well,
there.
I think we're almost out of time now.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but if you'd like to stay around, maybe come down and talk to our panelists. I feel really fortunate to have such an articulate and distinguished panel here. We thank Dick Barrett for moderating it, and we thank you for coming.